we have 239 souls vanished. No mayday, no distress call, just silence. But what if I told you the pilot didn't lose mechanical control? He took control and created a flying coffin. In today's episode, we're breaking down why Malaysia Airlines and the Malaysian government still refuse to call the disappearance of MH370 a mass murder suicide. We'll explore why this wouldn't fly in the American justice system. In the US, we charge and convict people for murder for far less evidence than what exists in this case, all built on circumstantial facts. You want to know the difference between our system and other legal systems? Our system doesn't need a smoking gun when the entire room smells like gunpowder. I'm Jerome Hill, and with me is retired Sheriff Victor Hill, and we're your hosts of Hill of Justice.
Two brothers, sons of a Navy SEAL. Jerome Hill, a former Baltimore PD officer and narcotics detective. Victor Hill, the former sheriff of Clayton County and author of Vigilante Sheriff. Now, they've joined forces to break down the hottest topics in law enforcement and beyond on the Hill of Justice.
On March 8th, 2014, with 239 people on board, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 left an airport in Malaysia and was expected to arrive in Beijing, China. It really disappeared from commercial radar less than an hour into flight. So at 1:19 in the morning, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah calmly radios, "Good night, Malaysian 370. Seconds later, the plane's transponder, ACARS, and SATCOM systems were manually switched off in sequence, not simultaneously as you would expect in a technological failure. This implies a calculated, deliberate act with intent. The plane goes dark from radar, but is later tracked by military satellites, making a sharp turn west, flying over Malaysia and into the southern Indian Ocean, on a route that only a skilled pilot could pull off. Now, brother, I want you to see this for yourself and watch how this unfolds and ask yourself, does this look like an accident or intent?
Boeing had included a maintenance reporting thing that goes by satellite. It was called an ACARS system, and Boeing had installed this system to report maintenance information about the engines and the airplane every hour. In this particular case, it was still pinging away. It was saying essentially to the satellite, "Hey, I'm here. You want any information?"
The information revealed by the ACARS system was shocking. It showed that the plane did not crash anywhere near where it was last detected. It actually changed course and kept on flying.
It was flown for another 6 hours after it made the initial diversion from its intended flight plan, and it was flown to a very remote area.
Based on this data, aviation experts believe that the plane most likely crashed somewhere in the southern portion of the Indian Ocean after running out of fuel. It seems that the aircraft flew in the wrong direction for thousands of miles to a distant part of the ocean where there was no possible place to land.
That's obviously suicide. And let me tell you this, brother. The sad part about this, I spent a decade in homicide, and what a lot of people don't know is we don't respond just to homicides. We're more like death investigators. Our job is to go there and see, okay, was it a homicide? Was it a suicide? Was it a natural death? Or was it an accidental death? Because there are a lot of scenes that can be confusion if you don't know what you're looking at. There are times suicides look like homicides, homicides look like suicides, and there are times where actually natural deaths can look like it's a homicide. A person has a seizure, goes into a diabetic coma, but before that happens, they hit furniture, they fall, their head may hit something, and it looks like they were beaten, but really it's a natural death. So you got to take the totality of the circumstances and reconstruct the crime scene in order to make that determination. Well, there's already a lot of clues. The good night, the fact that you said that the controls were shut down systematically. There was a change in flight. and then they were going somewhere where there wasn't enough fuel where they could get to a possible landing spot. Here's what I will always wonder about this. There are two pilots there. So what happened to the second pilot? Did he somehow decapacitate that pilot? And if he did so, how? And what did he do those 6 hours? Did he do something to take his life and just put the plane on autopilot to let it happen then, and he was unconscious for the actual crash or whatever? We'll never know. But, my heart goes out to the people that was in the plane because, they're helpless. If they use the same security methods we do here in America, they can't get inside the cockpit because it's locked. Maybe someone on board, like a flight attendant, realized, hey, we're not going the right direction, or this is taking longer than it should. Because I don't know what the destination was and what the time is there. But if you actually got a flight attendant in that plane and they're supposed to arrive somewhere in 4 hours, and now the plane is still flying and they can't get the pilot's attention to say anything to him, you can imagine the panic and terror in those last hours of their life when they're helpless and they don't know what to do.
Yeah. And some of the questions that you have, let me try to fill it in a little bit.
Sure.
The co-pilot was Farik Abdul Hamid. He was 27 years old, and he was relatively new to the Boeing 777 series. The co-pilot's phone briefly connected near Penang, suggesting that he may have tried to send a final signal. And with 239 passengers, 0 texts, 0 calls, 1 phone pings the co-pilots, that's not a coincidence. That's a cry for help. So what they believe most likely happened was the fact that the pilot asked the co-pilot to step out of the cockpit. Now, when that happens, there is a protocol for the flight attendant to come into the cockpit to sit down temporarily. But what they believe happened is 2 things. As he asked the co-pilot to leave and the flight attendant comes in, he then, of course, he's the captain of the airplane, asked him to go, asked the flight attendant to leave for a moment, and he locks it behind him. Now, he was able to, and what they believe thereafter was, he depressurized the cabin in the back. So when you do that, hypoxia happens. You might be familiar with hypoxia. Do you remember a golfer by the name of Payne Stewart? Back in 1999, he was traveling, him and a team of individuals were traveling on a Learjet, and they were supposed to be going to a golf tournament. And so dispatch was calling them, and they realized that there was an error. So they sent fighter jets, military jets up into the air to find out what was going on. And I believe that the military jets was able to take a look inside in the cockpit and said, there's nobody conscious. So they were up there, and if the plane was going to go ahead and go anywhere near civilian population, they were going to shoot it out of the sky. The Learjet did go for some time until it ran out of fuel and then plummeted to the earth into a field. So they believe that that is the most likely scenario of what happened here, which is another form of intent that this person had. Now, if you're a 27-year-old co-pilot, you're not going to go ahead and think that, a more seasoned pilot is going to go ahead and ask you to do something that's going to jeopardize himself along with 238 other souls. And so that seems to be the most likely scenario with it. But there's more to this than that, and unfortunately, they weren't able to go ahead and tell that the pilot in itself had a 6-year gap in medical checkups. And plus, they believe that there was, although not confirmed, that there was a secret string of calls to a doctor days before the flight. He was rumored to have marital and emotional issues, and I guess he was estranged from his wife recently and spent some time alone and isolated. But brother, it's not even that. It was what he was doing thereafter. He had a home flight simulator. Did you know that? So he had a home flight simulator, and he was making practice runs on it for routes deep into the southern Indian Ocean, matching exactly what Malaysian Airlines 370 suspected path was. And some of the data that he deleted it from there. Pilots don't delete simulations over empty oceans by accident. And this was not curiosity. What I think it was? I think it was a rehearsal. He was rehearsing this. And you would see that in homicide too, wouldn't you?
Well, exactly. You answered the question I was going to ask you next. We used to do, anytime we worked the scene of a suicide, we would do what was called a psychological autopsy. And what that means is we would trace what was going on in that individual's life. Not everybody leaves a suicide note. Well, in a situation like this, you're not going to find one anyway, unless he left one at his home. So you have to go back and retrace what was going on in their lives. You have to interview family members and friends, subpoena bank records, medical records, see if you could come up with a motive for the suicide if there isn't an actual suicide note. And then, of course, sometimes you got to be careful with suicide notes. It may not be their handwriting. You got to verify that. Some people will write a suicide note and kill somebody. But unalive somebody rather, but you just answered a question for me, because I wanted to know what was a psychological autopsy. And when you find stuff like that, you pretty much come up with the motive. The sad thing about this, Jerome, is this. First of all, we don't want to see anyone take their life, but why take so many other innocent lives with you? Why, spread that pain? And not just the lives you took with you, but the families that have to live knowing that their relative spent the last 6 hours of their life in a plane with a person who had mental issues, that had no intentions of coming back and wanted to take everybody with him. And, that's the one thing that we will never completely understand. Why was it so necessary for him to do it that particular way with those individuals?
Right.
He could have just taken off on the plane by himself and did that if that's what he wanted to do.
He really could. He really could have done that. So why I characterize this definitely as a mass murder suicide is, we can use some philosophy here, and we could draw a premise and construct it and make what an argument is supposed to look like to draw a conclusion, right? So when we use deductive reasoning, we know that the transponder was manually turned off. The flight path was intentionally altered, and no other party could access the cockpit controls except for the pilot. Therefore, the conclusion is the pilot is responsible. But let's use inductive reasoning. We know that the pilot had personal stressors, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
He practiced the same remote flight path on a simulator. That's number two. And he was alone in the cockpit when systems were disabled, systematically. Therefore, he carried out and planned this mass murder suicide. As I mentioned earlier in the monologue, it doesn't take much in the American justice system to go ahead and convict you for circumstantial evidence. We've done that for far less. So this is where Zahari planned this moment. He lured Farik out and then created decompression, and then his stealth maneuver, as in changing the flight path, was just as diabolical as anything else. He knew exactly where, at least where the commercial radar was, that it couldn't be detected once he left out of there. And he hugged that whole entire area to go differently so they could not find not only himself, but everyone else. And this leads to more of what you're saying. Why take so many other people out? You know. But my question to you is this. They're not claiming it's terrorism. And I agree, but they're not claiming it because some people might believe, hey, guess what? This got to be terrorism in a sense, but not necessarily. And the reason being for that is that, we know obviously that, these individuals that do this, they have a political motive. They want people to fear something. He didn't telegraph this to anybody else. It was nothing like that. As you were mentioning, a lot of people leave suicide notes. None to be found. They investigated every single person on that plane. They did do the things that you were talking about. They did go to their homes, to their friends' homes. They went to their schools, their jobs, all types of personal relationships. They could not find a terrorist link in that situation. And so, if you ask me, if a man walks into a room, locks the door, he cuts out the lights, and nobody comes out alive, what do you call that? And because if it's a commercial pilot and the government needs to save face, suddenly it's an unsolved mystery. And that's where I have a problem with Malaysian Airlines and the Malaysian government.
Let me ask you this. Once that airline went off course, like you gave the analogy of what happened here in America, where when they saw what was going on, they sent some fighter jets up to see what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Did Malaysia do anything like that at all?
No. In fact, they knew something was amiss, and they just kept on trying to raise a Malaysian Airlines 370. But they saw, as I was saying, they saw certain systems going offline. But no, they did not. And I'm not quite sure if they have the capacity like we do here in America, So as far as I'm concerned, that wasn't a glitch. That was a deliberate act,
Yeah, I can only imagine. I know one time, this has been a while ago, I flew into New York on a commercial jet. And just as we were about to land, the plane took back up and started circling, and no one said why. And everyone was looking around trying to figure out what the problem was. And, and unfortunately, the pilot didn't for a while say what was going on. And I can't even remember what the reason was for it, but it just took everybody by surprise because we're thinking we're going to land, and then all of a sudden we don't land. And it was something I can't remember. It's been so long ago, but you could feel and see the tension in people on the plane because they couldn't figure out what was going on. And of course, you're at the mercy of the pilot, and then no one's saying anything, and not even the airline stewardess. But we circled around for about 30 minutes, and then we went ahead and landed, and that was the end of that. So you can imagine up until the time that what you're saying may have happened, that may have caused people to lose consciousness, what these people may have been thinking. Because did anyone say how long it took if they had went to the destination they were supposed to go to, how long it would have took to make it to that destination?
It would have. I'm not clear on that one, but I do know that the flight path, as it glided, on the video it says 6 hours. It glided for 7 hours. Now remember, it would have enough fuel to go ahead and get to Beijing, China, which is not a very far flight from Malaysia to Beijing. So I want to make that completely clear.
Okay.
The issue was how he banked to the west, and he started going into the Indian Ocean, far different from going over to Beijing. The issue was, and why I brought up Payne Stewart being so significant, that Payne Stewart's plane, although small and it's a Lear jet, it lost fuel as it was gliding, but it was losing altitude. So
Right.
this plane, no. It wasn't losing altitude. So the only inference that you can make at this point in time was, of course, we don't have a written manifesto. We don't have political statements. We don't have any type of affiliation in that sense. But as you can just imagine, the flight data was manually wiped in midair after the power was cut. And the aircraft reboots, and the investigators discovered something that was crazy. The flight ID was manually erased. So these are all conscious efforts to go ahead
I
and
agree.
take care of everything.
I agree. How long was it on autopilot? A lot of pilots fly the majority on autopilot. They just kind of like sitting there making sure. What did they say about that?
So this is what they were talking about. So that would have been for 7 hours. Yeah, the maneuvers happened right after 40 minutes after they took off, and then it was going erratic in certain places and so on and so forth. And but the chilling part is, Malaysian Airlines. I mean, good night, Malaysian Airlines 370, and that was the extremely vicious part. It was calm, cool, collected. Somebody who would do something like this.
So, this kind of reminds me of a podcast we did a few episodes ago where we were talking about the mental health of cops. And, usually cops, they get a mental health check to get hired unless they're involved in an officer involved shooting or something dramatic. That doesn't happen again. And, there's been certain situations I had to order it based on some conduct of some of my deputies, or some of them were just involved in some very dramatic incidents where they didn't necessarily kill anybody. But imagine you're chasing someone and the suspects hit a car and they killed someone or multiple people, and these guys could feel responsible for it, even though it's the actual suspect that initiated the chase. But still yet, I would tell them to just go ahead. Let's just make absolutely sure, because different people have different stress levels. Well, you and I both agreed that that's something there should be a mental health check every 3 to 6 months for officers based on the type of things they're exposed to. Because I don't know if people really understand the things that cops are really exposed to. We see things that a lot of people hear about on TV. I can remember going to a scene where a man chopped in 9 pieces. And so you got to wonder, how did these other officers, especially the younger ones or the rookies, responded to that, even though that's something I've been used to seeing over the years. Well, maybe it's time that we keep an eye on pilots, their mental health, and their status. Maybe there needs to be a check, because if you got a pilot that he just got a divorce, or he's just lost everything in a divorce, or going bankrupt or whatever, that's the type of thing you might want to know before he takes off. I know I would like to know that before I get on the plane. And, we usually don't think about these things, unfortunately, until something happens.
Right.
And then when something happens, a lot of people just shrug it off. Well, that probably will never happen again. That's a once in a lifetime thing. And, unfortunately, preemptive and proactive things are frowned upon based on this new political climate. But if we want to keep people alive, and if we want to feel safe when we get on these commercial flights, we might need to get to that point. Unfortunately, it's probably going to happen again before someone does anything. And it may have to happen in this country before those type of regulations are brought to light.
Right. So this is officially classified as an accident. This meets international aviation standards. I guess it's necessary for insurance and legal closure, and to save their own butts financially. Let's be honest. Just like we've talking about prior episodes, what's in it for Malaysia Airlines to go ahead and claim responsibility that one of their pilots had acted in a murderous attempt? A successful murderous act. Well, nobody's going to try to take that responsibility. And what about the Malaysian government? Unlike the American government, they're a prideful people, and I get it. And this pilot, unless otherwise with any type of definitive evidence, in some circles, he's considered a hero because of the mystery of all this. But of course, we understand that all the acts that was being done can only lead to one way. If it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, most likely it's a duck, right?
Right.
But it comes back to a previous episode that we have is, why do police departments protect police officers when they commit bad acts? They're not going to go ahead and say, what, this officer did this or did. I mean, some do, don't get me wrong. I don't want to go ahead and paint a broad brush like that. But for most, they don't do that. Let's see until the investigation is over. They'll talk about in that vein. It's still an open investigation. They don't want to get hit with a bevy of lawsuits. So they got to worry about that. The city has to worry about getting sued. Of course, any type of police captain, so on and so forth. They would have to go ahead and worry about those things. So more to your point and what you were saying, this is why responsibility is not taken right away. Nobody wants to get into this legal conundrum. And that's what we can only call it at that time.
Yeah, I think you got a good observation there, brother. And that's pretty sad because we know we could easily see a lawsuit where in this country where it'd be negligence because they would say, well, you didn't make sure the pilot had mental health assessments regularly, which is something, like I said, I think we probably should start doing before we see this happen again. Because if there's nothing in place to stop it, we will see it again at some point.
Sure. And the most insidious part about this is that it only takes one man or woman to commandeer an entire plane, and everyone is at the mercy of that one individual. And I think
Absolutely.
that's the scariest part, that everyone who flies has to deal with or contend with. Now, many times do we take a look at one another when we're driving, unless we're in Jamaica and we're driving. But,
Right.
that you look at someone and be like, do you know what you're doing?
Right.
We expect our pilots to have a super amount of professionalism and certainly skill sets to keep on moving. However, you're right. We get into a situation like this. Not only is it no good and bad times, you're talking about all souls on the air and untold amount of souls on the ground, depending on where this plane goes.
Where it lands. Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. You're right.
this is not just a situation, and we don't even think about it. How many planes that fly above us on a daily basis? We don't even pay any attention to that because we're not eye level with it. We may hear it, but we don't see it, especially from 35,000 feet up. And so that's
And if
probably,
they decide to just dive,
I mean,
absolutely.
just think about the ridiculousness after that. I mean, this was, you
It takes
don't
you back
even
to
want to think about
9/11.
it. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Well,
So,
I've always said, brother, especially when I talk to young guys that want to be officers, I always tell them, listen, the hardest thing about being an officer is keeping yourself in a particular state of mind because it's easy to get complacent. You're on the job and you got plans. You're going with your family to St. Thomas, or you're attending a wedding or getting married that weekend or whatever, and you're looking forward to the future.
right,
But the next call you ride might be a guy who doesn't have a future
hmm
and he has no intention of going past tomorrow.
right,
And he's willing to take you or anybody with him. And if you're not able to take your mindset to where it needs to be, you could well not survive that situation. Now, of course, don't get me wrong. No one's thinking like that when they get on a plane. They're just reading a book, going to sleep or whatever. But we
right,
got to be situationally aware that there are people around us that they're not trying to go home.
right. Well,
And
I
when
will,
they're not trying to go home, it puts everyone in danger.
I will leave you with this, and certainly this is probably the prevailing situation that we have here. As you know, mental health isn't weakness, and it's maintenance, right? But in aviation, admitting that you need help can cost you your career. Who wants to lose their career after everything that they have worked for so long? And then to say, I need help, and then that's taken away from you. You're broken after that. So there is, unfortunately, a stigma with that. And we need to change that if we're going to gamble with lives up at 35,000 feet, you know.
I agree. And then we also got to deal with the lawfare aspect of it, because just like people use the criminal justice system to weaponize against someone and they'll make up a charge, there are people who may try and eliminate a pilot by saying, okay, well, I don't think he's mentally fit. And if they're able to do what prosecutors and judges have been seen to do lately, they could ruin someone's career like that. It may not be legit. So it needs to be in place, but there also needs to be checks and balances to make sure that is actually accurate and there's nobody just trying to use that as a technical way to disqualify people.
Sure. So I want to leave everyone with the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Call or text 988. That is probably the best way. It's available nationwide for anyone in emotional distress or suicidal crisis. It's very important to do that. We just want to tell everyone, please follow, subscribe, like, and comment below. Give us your opinions about the show and everything that's went on. So, Keith, that's all I have for today. And until next time on the Hill of Justice, we'll see you later.
See you later, brother.